The lecture hall buzzed with quiet conversation as students filed in and took their seats. The room was enormous, built to accommodate the diverse species of the Galactic Confederation. Some students sat in traditional chairs, others floated in special containment fields, and a few rested on heated platforms designed for their unique biology. Professor Thalen entered through the main doors, his feathers catching the soft blue light that illuminated the space. The Valkyrie historian was well known throughout the academy, respected for his knowledge and feared for his sharp tongue. His 4 arms carried multiple data pads, which he arranged carefully on the podium at the front of the room. The students settled quickly. Insectoid krill clicked their mandibles in anticipation. Crystalline beings refracted light across the walls in shifting patterns. Gaseous nephri hummed inside their containment suits. All eyes turned to the professor. In the back row, James Walker sat quietly with his own datapad open. The human student had learned during his first weeks at the Galactic Confederation Academy that being the only member of his species in most classes came with challenges. Other students stared at him. Professors sometimes forgot to adjust examples for human understanding. And occasionally, like today, his entire species became the subject of discussion. He'd learned to stay quiet, to observe, and to pick his moments carefully. "Good morning," Professor Thalen began, his voice carrying easily through the amphitheater. "Today we begin a new unit in Military Tactics 401. We will examine primitive warfare, specifically the combat methods used by species before they achieved space travel." The holographic display activated above the professor's head. Images appeared showing ancient weapons, crude swords made of metal, wooden spears with stone tips, and early powder-fired guns that looked more dangerous to their users than their targets. Several students chittered with amusement. A krill in the front row translated the reaction for others. "How quaint." They fought with handheld implements. Professor Thalen's beak clicked in what James had learned was the Valkyrie equivalent of a smile. Indeed. These methods represent the absolute infancy of military thought. Brute force applied directly. Close quarters violence. Highly inefficient resource allocation. The hologram shifted to show masses of soldiers standing in neat rows, holding those primitive weapons. They looked tiny and vulnerable compared to the advanced warfare the students had studied in previous lessons. "These formations," the professor continued, gesturing with 2 of his 4 arms, "show a fundamental misunderstanding of combat efficiency. Placing large numbers of your own population directly in harm's way. Remarkable, really, that any species survived such wasteful tactics long enough to develop better methods." More polite laughter rippled through the classroom. James kept his expression neutral, his eyes on his datapad. "The species that employed these methods," Professor Thalen said, his tone growing more dismissive, "rarely survived their primitive phase. The resources wasted, the populations destroyed, the infrastructure damaged. Most never recovered enough to reach for the stars." He paused deliberately, his dark eyes scanning the room. Those that did survive had to overcome tremendous cultural obstacles. They had to learn cooperation, restraint, and rational resource management. They had to essentially rebuild themselves from barbarism. James felt the weight of attention shift toward him before he saw it. Students were turning in their seats, looking at the only human in the room. Professor Thalen's gaze landed on James and stayed there. The humans, for instance, provide an excellent case study. They spent approximately 6,000 years in nearly continuous warfare with themselves. 6,000 years. Fighting over the same planet, destroying the same resources, killing their own species in increasingly creative ways. The hologram changed to show images from Earth's history. Medieval castles under siege. Soldiers in trenches covered in mud. Cities burning under aerial bombardment. The progression was damning. Their tactics were unsophisticated but enthusiastic, the professor continued. They threw massive numbers of their population into what they called meat grinders. They destroyed their own infrastructure to deny it to enemies who were, remarkably, also themselves. They even contaminated portions of their own planet with weapons specifically designed to render land uninhabitable for generations. A nephri floated closer to get a better look at the images. "How did they have any population left?" "An excellent question," Professor Thalen replied. "The answer is disturbing. They simply produced more. They turned reproduction into a strategic resource. More soldiers, more workers, more bodies to throw at problems." James's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent. "It's quite fascinating from an academic perspective," the professor went on. "The sheer waste, the absolute inefficiency, the barbaric nature of it all. And yet, somehow they survived long enough to build spacecraft and join civilized society. He turned back to face the class fully. This is why we study primitive warfare, students. Not to learn from it, but to understand what we avoided by developing peacefully. To appreciate the rational, efficient methods that brought our various species to the stars without tearing ourselves apart first. The hologram now showed a comparison. On one side, human warfare with its chaos and destruction. On the other side, the peaceful expansion of Valkyrie civilization, orderly and controlled. Humans represent perhaps the most extreme example of a warlike species somehow stumbling into spacefaring capability, Professor Thalen said. Their entire cultural identity is shaped by violence. Their entertainment features it. Their history celebrates it. Their languages have dozens of words for different types of killing. James's hand slowly rose into the air. The classroom fell silent. Even the constant background sounds seemed to stop. Professor Thalen's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a clear sign of surprise. "Yes, Mr. Walker?" the professor asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Do you have something to add to our discussion of your species' primitive nature?" James stood slowly, gathering his datapad. His voice was calm and respectful when he spoke. "With respect, Professor, I wonder if I might offer some additional context to human military history. Since I'm here and it is my species being discussed, perhaps a primary source would be valuable." The professor's feathers ruffled slightly. Several students leaned forward with interest. This was unusual. The quiet human student rarely spoke in class. "By all means, Mr. Walker," Professor Thalen said, gesturing magnanimously toward the front of the room. "Please enlighten us about your species' 6,000 years of hitting each other with sticks. I'm sure we could all benefit from some entertainment before we move on to more sophisticated military theory." More laughter echoed through the hall, though some students looked uncomfortable with the professor's mocking tone. James walked down the steps toward the front of the classroom, his footsteps quiet on the smooth floor. He connected his datapad to the holographic system with practiced ease. "How much time do I have, Professor?" James asked politely. "Oh, let's say 10 minutes, Thalen replied, waving a dismissive hand. "Surely that's sufficient to cover millennia of barbarism." "I'll need at least the full class period," James said calmly, meeting the professor's eyes. 35 minutes minimum." Professor Thalen's feathers stood up slightly, a sign of irritation. But curiosity won out. "Very well, Mr. Walker. 35 minutes. Do try to keep it educational rather than simply defensive." James nodded and turned to face the assembled students. Dozens of alien faces watched him with various expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to amusement. "Let me tell you a story," James began quietly. "Let me tell you what happens when an intelligent species has no one else to fight but themselves for 6,000 years. Let me explain what we learned and what it cost us to learn it." He activated his first holographic image. Roman legions appeared above the students' heads, marching in perfect formation, their armor gleaming. "And let me explain," James continued, his voice growing stronger, "why the Galactic Confederation specifically requested human military advisors at every single defensive installation along the contested border. Why your governments asked for us specifically when the Ravagers appeared." Professor Thalen's feathers went completely flat against his body. His beak opened slightly but no sound came out. James smiled slightly. "Because, Professor, we didn't just learn how to fight. We learned how to win." James stepped forward and connected his datapad to the holographic display. The entire classroom watched as ancient images flickered to life above their heads. Rows of soldiers in red cloaks and bronze armor marched in perfect formation across a golden field. "These are Roman legions," James began, his voice calm and steady. "About 2,000 years ago they conquered most of the known world on Earth. Not because they were stronger than everyone else but because they were smarter." A Krill student in the front row clicked its mandibles in confusion. "Smarter how?" "They carry pointed sticks." James smiled slightly. Those pointed sticks were standardized equipment. Every soldier had the same gear, the same training, the same tactics. But more importantly, the Romans understood something that most species don't learn until they reach space. He zoomed in on the hologram, showing roads stretching across continents, supply depots and fortified camps. Logistics. The Romans knew that wars aren't won by brave soldiers alone. They're won by getting those soldiers to the right place at the right time with enough food, water, and equipment to fight. Professor Thalen's feathers ruffled with interest. "Supply chains? For ground combat." "Exactly," James replied. "The Romans built roads so their armies could march faster than any enemy could retreat. They established supply stations every 30 miles. They created field hospitals to treat wounded soldiers and get them back into formation. They even invented standardized rations that wouldn't spoil during long campaigns. The hologram shifted to show a massive siege tower rolling toward stone walls. And when they couldn't go around an obstacle, they engineered their way through it. Siege weapons, battering rams, tunnels under walls. Every problem had a solution. A crystalline student shimmered with light, its translator processing the information. But surely one species would develop a counter-strategy? Oh, they did, James said, his expression darkening slightly. Everyone did. That's the point. The display changed dramatically. Now it showed horsemen sweeping across vast grasslands, moving like a brown wave over green earth. Their bows were small but deadly, their horses incredibly fast. These are the Mongols, James continued. About 800 years ago they built the largest land empire in human history. They conquered more territory than the Romans ever dreamed of, and they did it with a fraction of the resources. A Nefri floated closer, its containment suit humming. How is that possible? Speed and communication, James explained. The Mongols could coordinate attacks across thousands of miles. They used relay stations with fresh horses so messages traveled faster than armies could march. They studied every enemy before attacking. They learned weaknesses. They adapted tactics. He pulled up another image showing a burning city. And they used psychological warfare. They gave cities one chance to surrender. If the city refused, the Mongols would destroy it completely and make sure everyone in the region heard about it. The next city would surrender without a fight. Professor Thalen leaned forward, his forearms crossed. Terrorism as military doctrine? Terror as a force multiplier, James corrected. The Mongols understood that winning one battle brutally could prevent 10 others. It saved Mongol lives in the long run. Brutal? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. The hologram shifted again, this time showing medieval castles with thick stone walls and deep moats. Knights in heavy armor charged across fields on massive war horses. So humans built castles, James said. Fortifications that could withstand months of siege. Heavy cavalry that could break through any infantry line. For a while, these were unstoppable. A student in the middle row spoke up nervously. For a while? Until we invented pike formations, James replied. The hologram showed soldiers with long spears arranged in tight squares. Suddenly heavy cavalry was useless. So we invented crossbows that could punch through armor. Then we invented better armor. Then we invented longbows that could punch through the better armor from 300 yards away. He looked around the classroom, making eye contact with as many students as he could. Do you see the pattern? Every advantage was temporary. Every weapon created a counter-weapon. Every defense sparked a new offense. We couldn't stop fighting each other, so we got better and better at it. The crystalline student shimmered again. But why not simply stop? Why continue this cycle? James paused, considering his answer carefully. Because there were always reasons to fight. Resources, territory, religious beliefs, political power. And because once one group developed a new tactic or weapon, everyone else had to learn it or die. It was an arms race that lasted thousands of years. He pulled up a final image showing castle walls crumbling under cannon fire. And then we invented gunpowder. That changed everything. Suddenly those thick castle walls that took decades to build could be knocked down in days. The entire system of medieval warfare became obsolete overnight. Professor Thalen's voice was quiet now, thoughtful. And this continued? This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. For 6,000 years, James confirmed. And it got worse. Much worse. The weapons got bigger. The tactics got deadlier. The casualties got higher. He looked at the professor directly. Would you like me to continue? The Valkyrie nodded slowly, his feathers completely flat against his body. James took a breath and changed the hologram again. The holographic display changed and the entire classroom gasped. Stretching across the air above them was a landscape that looked like another planet entirely. The ground was torn apart into long ditches filled with mud and water. Twisted metal wire covered everything. Trees stood as blackened stumps. The sky itself looked gray and poisonous. This is France in 1916, James said quietly. This is what we call the Western Front during World War I. A Krill student's translator struggled with the words. World War? Your entire planet fought. Most of it, James confirmed. He zoomed in on the trenches, showing soldiers huddled in the mud, their faces hollow and exhausted. The war lasted 4 years. Approximately 20 million people died. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Several students made distressed sounds. A Nefri's containment suit flickered with what James had learned was shock. 20 million? Professor Thalen repeated slowly. From one conflict on one planet? From one conflict, James said. And we didn't fight with swords anymore. We industrialized warfare. We turned it into a factory. The hologram showed massive cannons firing, their shells screaming across scarred landscapes. Artillery could fire shells 20 miles. Bombardments lasted for days, sometimes weeks. The ground would shake constantly. Soldiers went deaf from the noise. Some went mad from the stress. He changed the image to show soldiers going over the top of trenches, running toward enemy positions across open ground. Many fell before they made it halfway. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute. One man with a machine gun could stop 100 men advancing. Sometimes 1,000. A crystalline student's light dimmed with horror. But surely after the first attacks failed, you would change tactics? We did, James said grimly. We kept changing tactics. We tried night attacks. We tried surprise attacks. We tried massive bombardments first. Nothing worked well. The defense was too strong. So battles that should have lasted days lasted months. Millions of men fought over a few miles of destroyed ground. Professor Thalen's voice was barely a whisper. How did your species survive this? James pulled up another image. This time it showed green clouds rolling across a battlefield. Soldiers were clawing at their faces, falling, drowning in their own lungs. We invented poison gas. Chlorine, mustard gas, phosgene. It burned lungs, blinded eyes, blistered skin. So then we invented gas masks. Then we invented better gas that went through the masks. The classroom was completely silent now. Even the usual background sounds of movement and breathing seemed to have stopped. World War I ended in 1918, James continued. Everyone said it was the war to end all wars. We'd seen how terrible modern warfare could be. Surely we would never do it again. He paused and looked around the room. 21 years later, we started World War II. The hologram changed to show tanks rolling across fields, aircraft filling the skies, ships burning in harbors. The scale was enormous, dwarfing everything that had come before. World War II lasted 6 years, James said. The estimated death count is 70 to 85 million people. Several students stood up as if to leave. Others made sounds of denial. One began openly weeping through its translator. We bombed cities, James continued relentlessly. Not military targets. Cities full of civilians. We called it strategic bombing. The idea was to destroy the enemy's ability to make war by destroying their factories, their infrastructure, their will to fight. The hologram showed cities in flames, buildings reduced to rubble, civilian populations fleeing. Dresden, Tokyo, London, Berlin. Hundreds of cities burned. Millions of civilians died. A young diplomatic student named Emily, another human who usually sat quietly, had tears running down her face. She knew this history, but hearing James present it to aliens made it feel fresh and horrible again. And then, James said, his voice dropping even lower, we invented nuclear weapons. The hologram showed a mushroom cloud rising over a city. Then another. The clouds climbed into the stratosphere, spreading death for miles in every direction. These are Hiroshima and Nagasaki, James explained. 2 Japanese cities. 1 bomb each. Approximately 200,000 people died instantly or in the following weeks from radiation poisoning. Professor Thalen stood up slowly, all 4 of his arms trembling. You destroyed your own planet? We came close, James admitted. After the war ended, we built more nuclear weapons. Thousands of them. We pointed them at each other and developed something called mutually assured destruction. The idea was simple: if you attack us, we destroy you. If we attack you, you destroy us. Everyone dies. A student's voice cracked through its translator. That's insane. That's genocide. That's suicide. Yes, James agreed simply. But it worked. We haven't had another world war since 1945. Because we made war so terrible, so absolutely destructive, that even humans hesitated. He changed the hologram one more time. Now it showed military academies, training grounds, strategic planning rooms. But we didn't stop preparing. We studied everything we'd done. We wrote it all down. We created doctrine for every type of warfare imaginable. James looked directly at Professor Thalen. We have plans for wars we hope never to fight. Contingency plans for enemies we hope never to meet. Weapons designs we hope never to build. Not because we're paranoid. Because we know what happens when you're not prepared. The Valkyrie professor sat down heavily. His feathers were completely flat, a sign of deep respect or deep fear? Perhaps both. How, he asked quietly, does your species live with this history? James was quiet for a moment. By making sure it never happens again. By teaching every generation what it cost. By remembering. He gestured to the hologram still showing the mushroom clouds. And by making sure that if war does come, we end it quickly before it becomes this again. James took a deep breath and changed the holographic display again. This time the images showed stars, planets, and the black void of space. Ships moved between them in careful formations. When humanity reached the stars in 2143, James began, we thought maybe things would be different. We'd left Earth behind. We had new worlds to settle. No more fighting over the same piece of ground. He paused and smiled sadly. We were wrong. The hologram shifted to show alien ships, sleek and powerful, surrounding a human colony station. In 2157 we met the Kryn. They were an old species confident in their strength. They'd never lost a war. When they found our colony at Titan's shadow, they demanded we leave. We refused. They attacked. Professor Thalen leaned forward, his interest obvious despite his earlier horror. I remember reading about this engagement. The Kryn had superior ships. They did, James confirmed. Their dreadnoughts were faster, tougher, and better armed than anything we had. A fair fight would have been a massacre. A Krill student clicked nervously. So you retreated? No, James said simply. We didn't fight fair. The hologram showed the battle in detail. Human ships, smaller and weaker, launched clouds of small fighters. Hundreds of them, swarming like insects around the massive Kryn vessels. The Kryn fought ship to ship, James explained. Dreadnought against dreadnought, trading fire until one side broke. That's how they'd always fought. But humans had developed carrier tactics back on Earth centuries ago. We'd fought entire wars with aircraft carriers on our oceans. The small human fighters weaved through space, dodging and striking. The Kryn targeting systems couldn't track them all. Missiles hit from a dozen angles at once. We overwhelmed their defenses, James continued. Not with better technology but with better tactics. Tactics we'd learned fighting each other. A crystalline student shimmered with confusion. But surely after the first battle they adapted? James shook his head. They didn't have time. Because we didn't just attack their ships. We attacked their supply lines. The hologram changed to show cargo vessels exploding, supply depots burning, refueling stations going dark. The Kryn expected honorable combat. Fleet against fleet. Instead we hit their logistics. Cut off their fuel. Destroyed their ammunition supplies. Attacked their repair facilities. Professor Thalen's beak clicked rapidly, a sign of understanding. Roman tactics. In space. Exactly, James said. We'd spent thousands of years learning how to dismantle military organizations. The Kryn had never faced an enemy that fought like that. 6 weeks after they attacked Titan's shadow, they withdrew completely. They'd lost more to supply problems than to actual combat. Emily, the other human student, spoke up from the back of the room. Tell them about Proxima Station. James nodded grimly. Proxima Station. 2168. A mining outpost with 300 human civilians and 50 security personnel. The Ravagers attacked with overwhelming force. Thousands of soldiers against 50 defenders. The hologram showed a small station surrounded by enemy ships and boarding craft. It looked hopeless. Standard military doctrine says you negotiate when outnumbered 20-1, James explained. You surrender when the situation is hopeless. You save lives. The humans at Proxima didn't surrender, he continued quietly. They held for 87 days. The classroom erupted in shocked murmurs. A Nefri floated forward, its suit humming with disbelief. 87 days? How? They knew the station better than the attackers, James said. They used every air duct, every maintenance tunnel, every storage room. They built traps. They made the Ravagers fight for every corridor. And when they ran out of ammunition they used tools, pipes, anything they could find. The hologram showed the timeline of the siege. Day after day the small human force held positions that should have fallen in hours. By day 30 they had no food, James said. By day 50, they were drinking recycled water from the cooling systems. By day 60, half of them were wounded. Why didn't they surrender? A student asked quietly. Because a relief fleet was coming, James replied. And because humans have a long history of impossible last stands. Thermopylae, where 300 soldiers held a mountain pass against hundreds of thousands. The Alamo, where less than 200 defenders fought thousands. Stalingrad, where a city held through winter against an entire army. He looked around the classroom. We have cultural memories of these battles. Stories passed down through generations. When humans are cornered, when there's no way out, something in us says to keep fighting anyway. Professor Thalen spoke carefully. The report said when the relief fleet arrived, only 12 defenders were still alive. 12 out of 50, James confirmed. But the station was still in human hands. The Ravagers lost over 4,000 soldiers, taking corridors they'd have to give back. It changed their entire strategy for dealing with human settlements. The hologram shifted to show military training facilities, war colleges, simulation centers. Every human officer studies hundreds of historical battles, James explained. We run constant simulations. Desert warfare, forest warfare, urban combat, mountain fighting, orbital assault, void combat. We have doctrine for every environment because we've fought in all of them. A student raised a tentacle nervously. You mentioned the Ravagers earlier. They're currently attacking the contested border. Is that why the Confederation requested human advisors? James nodded slowly. When the Ravagers first appeared 3 years ago, every species tried negotiation. Tried to understand their motives. Tried diplomacy. All the normal approaches. Humans looked at the Ravagers and recognized something. He continued. We'd seen this behavior before. Species that don't negotiate, that only understand force, that keep attacking until they're stopped. He pulled up tactical maps showing the contested border, human advisors stationed at key defensive points. We told the Confederation how to stop them. Not how to talk to them. Not how to understand them. How to stop them. Professor Thalen's feathers rippled with a complex emotion. And it's working. It's working, James confirmed. Because sometimes the galaxy doesn't need philosophers or diplomats. Sometimes it needs someone who's seen the worst of war and knows how to end it quickly. The classroom fell silent, processing this information. Professor Thalen stood slowly, all 4 of his arms spreading wide in a gesture that commanded attention. The classroom fell completely silent. Even the constant background hum of environmental systems seemed to fade away. Mr. Walker, the Valkyrie professor said, his voice careful and measured. Your presentation has been deeply disturbing. You've shown us 6,000 years of violence, of innovation driven by the desire to kill more efficiently. You've demonstrated that humans are perhaps the most dangerous species in the Confederation. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on James. So I must ask the obvious question. Why should we trust you? What stops humanity from using all of this knowledge, all of these terrible skills, against the rest of us? The question hung in the air like a physical thing. James could feel every alien eye in the room watching him. Some students looked afraid. Others looked angry. A few looked simply curious, waiting for his answer. James nodded slowly. That's exactly the right question, Professor. And I'm glad you asked it. He changed the holographic display. Now it showed old documents, pages of text in multiple languages, official seals and signatures. These are the Geneva Conventions. Created in 1864, updated several times since. They're rules for warfare. A Krill student clicked in confusion. Rules for war? That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense if you've seen war without rules, James replied quietly. He pulled up specific sections. Treatment of prisoners. Protection of civilians. Medical personnel cannot be targeted. Certain weapons are prohibited. Torture is forbidden. These are laws that humans wrote for ourselves about how to fight. Professor Thalen's beak clicked thoughtfully. You created restrictions on your own military capabilities? Yes, James said. Because we learned what happens when there are no restrictions. We learned what total war looks like. We saw what it does to societies, to planets, to the soldiers who fight it and the civilians who suffer through it. The hologram shifted to show more documents. War crimes tribunals, international courts, peacekeeping forces. After World War II, we put our own leaders on trial for war crimes. We said that even in war there are lines you cannot cross. And if you cross them you will be punished. Emily spoke up from the back again, her voice steady. We created rules of engagement. Proportional response doctrine. The principle that you only use as much force as necessary to achieve your objective, nothing more. James nodded at her gratefully. Exactly. We have weapons we choose not to use. Tactics we choose not to employ. Not because we can't, but because we've decided we shouldn't. A Nefri floated closer, its containment suit pulsing with confused colors. But you said humans spent 6,000 years perfecting warfare. Why would you then limit yourselves? Because, James said, turning to face the alien directly, we know the cost. Every species in this classroom, every species in the Confederation except humanity, reached the stars through cooperation. You expanded peacefully. You never faced extinction from your own kind. He gestured around the room. You never had to choose between survival and genocide. You never had to decide whether winning a war was worth destroying your own planet. You never watched millions die and wondered if you could have stopped it. The hologram changed to show Earth from space, beautiful and blue and green. Humans did. We faced those choices. We made those decisions. And we have to live with the consequences every single day. Professor Thalen's feathers were completely flat now. You learned restraint through excess. Yes, James said simply. We learned that the species best at making war should be the first to choose peace. Because we understand what the alternative looks like. A young student, barely out of adolescence by the look of their species markers, spoke up nervously. But what about the contested border? You're teaching the Confederation how to fight the Ravagers. Isn't that just spreading your violence? James was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. The Ravagers are already violent. They're already killing peaceful species who have no idea how to defend themselves. We're not teaching the Confederation to be aggressive. We're teaching them to survive. He pulled up casualty reports from the contested border. Before human advisors arrived, the Confederation was losing 3 stations a month. Thousands of lives. After our tactics were implemented, losses dropped to near zero. We're not teaching you to attack, James continued. We're teaching you to defend. To protect yourselves and others. And more importantly, we're teaching you to end conflicts quickly before they escalate into the kind of nightmares humanity has experienced. Emily stood and walked down to join James at the front. Next week, I'll be presenting on human peace treaties, conflict resolution, and diplomatic history. Because military history is only half the story. The other half is learning when not to fight. Professor Thalen looked between the 2 human students. You believe war and peace are connected? They're inseparable, James replied. You can't truly understand peace unless you understand war. You can't commit to avoiding violence unless you know what violence really costs. He looked out at the assembled students, young beings from a dozen worlds who had never known real war. The Confederation invited humans to join not despite our history but because of it. You need species who understand conflict, who can recognize threats, who can defend the peaceful species when defense becomes necessary. But you also need species who will choose peace whenever possible, Emily added. Who understand that war is not glorious or exciting. It's terrible and should be avoided at almost any cost. Professor Thalen walked to the front of the classroom and stood beside the 2 humans. Mr. Walker, Miss Grant, I believe I need to completely revise my curriculum. Would you both be willing to develop a comprehensive course on human military and diplomatic history? James and Emily exchanged glances. Emily spoke first. We'd be honored, Professor. On one condition. Which is? The course emphasizes that the goal isn't to think like humans, she said. The goal is to learn what humanity learned. That the best warriors are the ones who fight only when they must. That true strength is choosing peace even when you could choose war. Professor Thalen's feathers rippled in the Valkyrie equivalent of a smile. Agreed. The classroom erupted into discussion. Students surrounded James and Emily, asking questions, requesting information, wanting to understand the species that had turned violence into a science and then chose to teach restraint. In the hallway outside, a Confederation military officer who had been quietly observing the lecture made a note in his report. Human integration proceeding as expected. Their value to the Confederation is becoming clear to all species. Recommend expanding human presence in military advisory roles and peace negotiation teams. He paused, then added one final line. Humanity's greatest strength is not their skill at war. It is their commitment to avoiding it. Inside the classroom, James looked at the eager young faces surrounding him and hoped desperately that they would never have to use the lessons he'd taught them. But he would teach them anyway. Because that was the price of peace. Being prepared for war while praying it never comes.